Welcome back to the Urban Monk, Dr. Pedram Shojai. Excited to share some really interesting work with you, Dr. Jason Klop and Shaina Cahill, who have been deep in the research of FMT. What is FMT? Fecal matter transplant. Sounds gross. It is saving lives. I keep following this story ever since we did Interconnected several years ago. And the literature is just getting more and more compelling. People with IBS, IBD, Crohn's disease, obviously C. diff, just a whole host of the really bad, nasty gut health, chronic gut health conditions. This is what has turned the corner. And really, these are folks that have not been able to find help anywhere else. There's some compelling data on autism and all sorts of mental health stuff coming with this. Why? The microbiome, when it is distorted, when it is disturbed, when it is no longer functioning the way we need it to function, has the wrong kind of outputs. It has the wrong kind of lipopolysaccharides versus the butyrates coming out. And so basically, you are harboring colonies of bugs that are creating a sauce that is not good for you. And some of these patients are just not able to bounce back from this. And so enter FMT. You come in, you wipe out the history, if you will, you clean your karma, and then you take on a graft of a healthy microbiome. And oh my goodness, really compelling. This is not for everyone. But if you have someone in your life or you yourself are suffering with a chronic gut condition, you need to hear this episode. Jason and Shaina, it is so good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having
Glad to
us.
be here.
Yeah, so I'm sure you guys have heard all the kind of flippant ways of talking about this. I've been around this conversation for a hot minute since we did, I think it was episode 8 of Interconnected. We covered the story of fecal matter transplant, and half the audience goes, "Oh my God, that's fascinating." Half the audience is, "I'm puking in my mouth." And it wouldn't still be a conversation if the freaking results weren't so damn good. And so would love to hear, maybe we can start with Jason, who started this party and then brought on Shaina, how you got into this journey and your experience that led you to really be in this really interesting line of work.
I would never have predicted 10 years ago that today I'd be sitting here having a conversation about shit. And it really started with, my background is as a naturopathic doctor. I really got honed in on digestive health and people struggling with digestive issues because ultimately they fall through the cracks from a percentage standpoint more than any other group when it comes to conventional healthcare. They just, I don't know, here's an anti-anxiety medication, an SSRI, that might help. And if all those things fail, you're probably crazy and you should see a psychiatrist. And so that was an obvious area that I got really fascinated with and started helping patients with, really honed in on like IBS, SIBO, IBD. And of course, that comes along with a whole bunch of like hormonal issues and everything else. As we well know, the digestive system is really the foundation of all health and well-being, and that's being borne out in the science today more than ever. So as the story goes, one time there was a prospective patient who reached out, was inquiring about doing this treatment, working with me as a patient. And I was having a conversation with her, and she went through her whole medical history. It was very extensive. Been there, done that, holistic, integrative, functional, conventional, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, you name it, she'd done it. To the point where her and her husband literally sold everything they owned, bought an organic plot of land, built their own completely environmentally like sustainable, clean home, grew all of their own organic food. And still, despite all of that, she was struggling with serious digestive issues, fatigue, brain fog, all of the typical symptoms that we might see. And I told her, I said, look, unfortunately, I don't think there's anything different or better or more innovative that I can provide to you than any of the things you've done and tried. And so I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you. But I said, I think you should consider FMT, Fecal Microbiota Transplant. And suddenly she perked up, found energy that she probably hadn't experienced in a long time. Said, oh my God, I'd love to do this, but there's just nowhere for me to access this treatment. I can't find it, and there's no way I can go overseas, which was the only option at the time to get access. That was in 2017. Early 2018, I began offering this as a treatment, starting out in Mexico. We later expanded to clinics around the world. The point of this whole story is really the urgency that I feel internally in making this accessible, because this patient couldn't get access to it. As soon as I found a way to make it possible, I reached out to her. This was in a matter of months. And she never responded to my emails, to my calls, or anything. And so I just presumed that she probably didn't make it. And that's, of course, unfortunate, but it's led to this revolution in education and expanding access still to this day. And so she sparked a crazy journey, ones with a lot of ups and downs, but ultimately creating access. And I'm happy to have you and, of course, Shaina along for the ride and helping spread awareness and education about something that today is accessible and can be truly life-changing and transformative.
Before we dive deeper into what the FMT truly is, Shayna, your role in this story and where you came in to help the good doctor with the research and kind of validating all this would be
Yeah.
nice touch. Yeah.
I'm a neuroscientist by education, so I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I studied kind of the impacts of non-traditional medicines and traditional medicines on the plasticity of the brain, how the brain changes as we age, and how we're approaching healing the brain. And in my master's, I actually looked at how feeding hormones change as we age and how that impacts memory and memory formation. And so all through my research, I've always looked at what other than prescription medicine should we be looking at to really tap into what the body can naturally do to heal itself. When I finished my PhD, I decided I did not want to be an academic. And so I entered the world of medical affairs and non-traditional medicines. And coming after I had my daughter, I wanted to do something different that I thought could make a really big difference. And I ended up finding Jason was looking for someone and I was looking. It was perfect timing. And as I've grown in the position, I feel really passionately about the ability to tap into resetting what our body should naturally be able to do and understanding that some of the ways we go at traditionally treating problems aren't a solution for a lot of people and trying to find ways that how can we look at this? What can the body naturally do when it's given the tools to do that? And the more you look into the connection for me, of course, between the gut and the brain. And I remember sitting in lectures when this was first coming out as a concept. And the idea was that makes sense. Why do we think of every unit within our body completely independently when clearly everything is connected? And so I think that's understanding how we're really learning and rewinding what we think of a condition as and when it starts and what are the early symptoms and why are we waiting till everything is already fallen, the wheels are off, versus understanding what are the first things. When does the immune system go off? When are the first red flags? And when we think about, for me, it's always been Parkinson's. I remember saying when they first really started looking at how Parkinson's consistently about 80% of people that are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease about 10 to 15 years before they're diagnosed, all show very similar GI profiles. They have constipation issues, they have a lot of GI distress, and that's 80% of people who 10 years later have Parkinson's. And to this day, we're still not really asking that question as why? And for me, it was like, that's the perfect example of why we've probably been asking the question wrong for a really long time and so focused on this being a brain issue where the brain comes later, the body is sending out signals early on. And I think that's what kind of drives my wanting to educate people on let's ask this question and let's figure out why those symptoms are happening so early and why are we ignoring them and what happens if we fix them.
Hallelujah. That's music to my ears. That's everything that's wrong with our allopathic model and waiting till things break and swimming upstream. It's a major ongoing theme on this show. Surprise is functional medicine looks for root cause and root of your health. The gateway to health is your gut. Now, let's circle in on FMT real quick because we want to talk about what it is. And I'm going to contextualize a little bit with Jason's story about, damn it, we tried everything. And there are patients within the patient population where that is the case. It's like, I tried the probiotics, I tried this. There's just a lot of maneuvering trying to rearrange and adjust the microbial colonies. But as we know, and our audience will soon know, look, these guys all have biofilm. They secrete all sorts of stuff that makes it very hard to dislodge and displace them. And a while back, someone came up with the idea of saying, what if we took the healthy microbiome from a healthy person and transplanted it into this really sick person? And I think the first, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was with C. diff infections and people with really nasty bugs that this thing's going to kill you. It's always a great place to start is people who are back against the wall. And there was miraculous results. So it was like, wait a minute, you could transplant healthy microbiome from a healthy subject into an unhealthy one. And then all of a sudden, symptoms alleviate, things get better, things start going. Am I correct in my kind of historical telling of that? And you could correct me on air all you want. I just want to make sure I'm telling that story.
Yeah, I think the modern evolution of FMT today is that story, but it does date back to 4th century China, where they were using it basically to treat dysentery. The traditional Asian medicine goes, like you said, it wouldn't be around if it didn't work. That's true of acupuncture, it's true of FMT, but the modern resurgence of it, yes, is around C. diff.
Got it. And C. diff being nasty, you get in the hospital, it's really bad, didn't know what to do with it. According to what my understanding still is, that's the one kind of known use application approved, like we do this for C. diff. But what started happening I don't know, 10 years ago when I started looking at this, and it just kind of got louder, and now you got Shaina researching it under your roof, and all this stuff starting to blow up, is IBD, Crohn's, IBS. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see this broader population with gut dysbiosis doing really well with this type of treatment. And I'll play a traffic cop here so you guys don't yell over each other. We'll go to Shaina and we'll come back to you, Jason. What are we seeing and how compelling is this data?
Yeah, so it's crazy because I think the beginning was C. diff, and there's still issues there with the fact that it's a third line treatment and it's compared to, we currently use antibiotics. They compare antibiotics to FMT directly, and FMT outperforms it. And yet you still have to go through 2 other treatment rounds before that's even an option. So I think that's part of it. And we see that in the idea of entering biologic medicines into the traditional pharma model. There's always a little bit of a holdup. But you start with the GI conditions. So the IBS, the IBD, then you start getting into neurological things. So we're seeing in autism spectrum disorder, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. Early on, we're now seeing some Alzheimer's disease stuff as well. But you also see it in autoimmune diseases. And so the thing here is when I first started in this space, the idea that the gut was the root of all of this, I was like, yeah, for some things. And the longer I've been doing it and the more that I research, and that's what everyone spends their time doing something. Mine is really digging into this and trying to understand, like, where does it not fit? There has to be a place where this isn't the answer. And the more you learn about what the gut does and how much of a driving force it is, and when you really break it down to the idea that, like, you use food to build everything you need and it goes through your gut and then it goes everywhere else, it really does start to make sense that, like, clearly it impacts everything. And we're seeing these huge changes in people that either there is no treatment option or they're non-responsive to treatment. And one of the crazy ones for me is that people who have cancer, who don't respond to immunotherapy, FMT is done using someone who did respond, who went into remission, and given to these people that are non-responders. And then they begin to respond to this cancer treatment. So the idea here is that, like, it can really solve problems of half of people respond and half don't, and we don't know why those half don't. But maybe the answer is that their body doesn't have the building blocks to use that medicine or ensure that it's converted correctly. So by taking someone who can and giving it to someone who can't, all of a sudden that problem's now fixed. And now they're responding to a traditional treatment. And in spaces where there isn't anything solving GI issues, then all of a sudden you're seeing impacts neurologically. But it starts to make sense because if you're in constant pain, that impacts things. If your body's not synthesizing neurotransmitters correctly, clearly there's going to be a neurological thing. So you're starting to see it everywhere. And I'm a natural skeptic because I'm a scientist and that's how they build us. But the more I read and the more I learn, I go, this is actually a thing. This is real. And while it seems almost unbelievable that the same thing for IBS could work for Parkinson's, it's really about restarting or re-educating your body to do what it needs to so that it can recover or it can build the things it needs to function properly.
Jason, let's talk about the ecosystem because, there is all this hype, and I think eventually we might catch up. And the day we do, great. Hey, we found some boutique strain that does X, Y, or Z, or we found a cluster of 3 strains that together help whatever. And we're getting there. We're understanding the butyrates and we're understanding some of these elements, but it is a vast ecosystem. And there's just so many multivariant outcomes that come from so much that these things communicate, these things signal to each other. And so this idea that we may get there, but right now you just take a healthy subject hopefully a healthy, happy subject that isn't living in a toxic environment. And then you'll talk about your assessment and how you screen these individuals, I would assume, bring their colonies and transplant them into an unhealthy subject and start to see that transference. I think it's brilliant. And I think it's just so damn simple that, yeah, it's almost like a head scratcher how well it works. So I'd love to hear about how we think about that and how we think about donors to get this right.
Sure. I think that's the goal in medicine, is to try to make this something synthetic, right? So that it can be a patented, here's the thing, and we'll get rid of these other more natural approaches. And frankly, I'd love to be the one to discover something that works as well as FMT, but doesn't rely on needing human donors that could be synthesized in some lab or grown in some way. That would be phenomenal. And I'd be rooting for that as an outcome as well. But the reality is, when we look at single or multi-strain probiotics, phages, like all of the stuff, it's just not panning out. And the key distinction ultimately is that FMT engrafts. It becomes a new part of your gut microbiome and the terrain that exists there. And so clearly, as you pointed out, there's some synergy in getting the full transplant. And a way that I often would describe this when having discussions with patients or people who were going through treatment was like, it'd be comparing taking some trees, which would be what you're doing with FMT, and trying to plant them somewhere and hoping you're going to get a jungle, versus like actually getting the Amazon jungle, encapsulating a whole portion of that and plopping that in. You're more likely then, if the other environmental terrain factors are right, for that to continue to create a long-term difference for that patient. And so that's really the critical part. But to the donors, that's the health of the jungle, the microbiome, right? That is what we're looking to attract. And we're looking to work with new prospective donors, and while we're maintaining them in the program. So there's a lot that goes into it. Ultimately, with FMT, the main concern is potential infection risk. And so that's like the priority, of course, that we're screening out. And that's the obvious stuff. All the infectious diseases, the STDs, like anything that could be infectious, we're basically testing for via stool, urine, and blood. That's happening before they're a donor. That's happening while they're a donor. And that's ongoing all the time using standard conventional labs. So that out, really though, there's a lot more to what makes a healthy microbiome and who the healthy human is that is attached to that. And so that's where we're looking at, are they breastfed? Are they vaginally born? Are they a healthy BMI? Are they physically fit and active? What's their diet look like? What's their immediate family medical history? What's their medical history? Because we don't even, as a case in point, we had someone very recently who submitted application to become a donor in our program. And on paper, they looked amazing. Great, no antibiotic history ever, eating a broad omnivorous diet, like all of the stuff that we're looking at. And then one of the things in their profile was their sibling has autism. Now, we don't know what part of this is genetic. Is there some microbiome component? Is it inherited? And so there's just unknowns there. So anytime there's a disease that we know has a microbiome component to it, which autism clearly does, we would then eliminate that person as a potential donor in our program, because we don't even want to take a chance if it's a direct family member, because there could be some risk that they have a profile, even though it didn't express in them, that it could be somehow related and passed down. So that's an example of one of many things that we're looking at screening and potentially eliminating. And to put a point on this, we accept roughly 1% of the people who apply to become a donor. This isn't like people on the street, and we're just screening people like random people on the street. No, this is people that come in knowing the requirements. And so it's very rigid as far as what we would even accept. And that I think is a big part of the success and the safety of the procedure. Ultimately, the bottom line we care about is this has to be safe, right? If it's effective, but there's a lot of risk, not interested. If it's effective but risky, yeah, we can't do that. So the goal is really the donor screening, and all of the stuff that happens there is a critical piece. And the lab and manufacturing standpoint, which is GMP, licensed by Health Canada, is also a very critical, important part of that safety and efficacy profile. So those two things combined get these great outcomes.
Yeah, and to add to that, like we're adding all of this on. So the blood and the stool and the urine, we do extend that, but that's what's required. We do make it a little bit, generally everybody should be doing that. The part that we're adding in is we're researching, where does the gut seem to be tied to a disorder? Okay, so family history, if that's there, maybe there's a possibility that there could be something in that person's gut that could leach out. So we take that out. Sleep issues, because we know sleep is tied to the gut. So we take that out. Allergies, if they have allergies, they're removed. And so the idea here is we're adding all of these extra hurdles because we would rather be safe because we don't know now than assuming it's probably not connected. Because as we're learning more about the gut, we're learning how much can be going on that could be impacting later health. And so the idea here is we would rather screen out more and have a harder time finding the right donors, but then knowing that long term, we're not setting anyone up. And in the beginning, the idea that we saw some FMT was being done with people that were obese and the recipients were getting those trends or trending towards that. So the idea here is there is proof that this should be accounted for. And so do we make our job a little bit harder? Yes. Do we feel like that's better for everybody involved? Also, yes. And so these are the things that we do differently because we want to ensure that even in places where we don't know, we err towards as much safety as possible.
I certainly hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. I geek out about this stuff. Again, this stuff is not for everybody, but boy, is it for the people who it is indicated for. Listen to the whole episode, and we took one of their onboarding surveys, turned it into a quick type form quiz to see if this is for you, just to qualify, because this is serious stuff. It is serious stuff for people who have serious problems. But if that's you, then what we've done is we've trained one of our physician's assistants to review this and then go over cases and say, if you qualify for this, just to hook you up with the right providers and get the right care. I really want to make sure that this is something done correctly and watch. And then there should be a link to the questionnaire. Whether you're listening to this, just go to where the podcast is on the website, find this podcast and click the questionnaire. If you got this in an email, then just click that. See if you qualify. Again, not for everyone, but if it's for you, man, this could change your stars. Back to the show. I'd hate to be in your recruiting department and here's 3 guys and 1 girl that we can choose from. It's hard. There's a lot of chronic disease out there. There's a lot of lifestyle issues out there. I'm sure it's harder and harder. I used to joke that Marty Blazer, when he blazed the trail on this, I think he was in Papua New Guinea and it's like following this tribe around, studying their poop. Those guys must have been like, who's this crazy white man? He was looking, and one of the major findings was, wow, these guys have incredible diversity. And they eat roots and shoots and tubers and all the things they're eating in their jungles that are the prebiotic fibers feeding the bugs that they're harboring. And so I don't know, maybe you guys have you find some donors, you get an organic farm somewhere in the mountains and teach them Zen meditation and just harvest that poop. And that becomes the winning formula where you start bringing out Rhodes Scholars.
On that idea, it's a joke, but hey, if it could become a reality, I've thought of literally having a private island someplace and creating that reality, because those people would be extremely valuable to us and, of course, the broader society. 100%. Not far off.
It's not something we haven't talked about in theory.
No, I've been around this topic. It is the joke around the water cooler, because at the end of the day, the quality of the health, mental, emotional, everything of the donor somehow is translating into the microbiome and in ways we don't quite understand. One of the things that you had alluded to that just came to mind when you're talking about encapsulating the jungle versus the individual trees is how much do we now know about the rhizosphere and this intricate web of connectivity of the fungal species in the soil that the trees communicate with. So here we are putting in individual trees, but you're not doing the rhizosphere. You missed the whole damn thing. And so it's just, we don't know what we don't know, but what we do know is somehow this works. And it's as safe as it's ever been. And who knows how much safer it can get, but y'all are doing all the screenings. Without getting into the gory details, how do you clean out the end product? Like, how do you manufacture something? I know you could do it by enema. There's a few ways to apply the treatment, but how do you run it through a lab and make it clinically safe enough to then have humans ingest it?
To the start of our conversation, we joked about shit. If there's anything that I'm trying to do is to reframe, rebrand how we think about this, because the end product is nothing like the starting source. And so ultimately, there's several different product types that we have, one of which is actually an oral powder. And this has been third-party tested that is substantially colorless, odorless, and tasteless. So doesn't in any way represent what you would imagine or picture when you're thinking about this treatment. And that's been patented, and we're expanding patents around the world because it is very unique and somewhat hard to achieve. Ultimately, what's happening and what the bulk of the stool is fiber and other waste products that don't have any obvious medicinal value, right? Like you can eat a fiber, you don't need it coming from a stool source. And so we're basically screening off and filtering off the vast majority of these sort of waste products that are the bulking agent of the stool. And we're really concentrating to everything that isn't that. And you're right, there's so much that we don't know. We think of like broadly the microbiome as bacteria. They may have nothing to do with why this is effective. I presume they have some impact, but the reality is it's all together. And it's not just the bacteria, it's not just the fungus, but maybe the combination of those. Maybe it's the metabolites that they're spinning off as they're doing their day-to-day metabolic work. And so there's so much that's involved, but ultimately that's from a manufacturing standpoint, depending on the product type, there's multiple steps involved that's purifying and concentrating these microbes so that per capsule of product, if you were just to take, and this is the DIY that's been happening and still continues to happen, is you just take whole stool, put it into a pill, close it up, and take it. That's poop. But this is the microbiome. This is everything that you would need encapsulated in a product that can be taken that doesn't have odor, doesn't have taste. Of course, it's double encapsulated and tear coated, so it gets through. And then the oral powder, which is predominantly for pediatric population, but can be taken and there's no taste, no odor, no smell, no nothing, and still very effective.
Yeah, don't try this at home, kids. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard is people eating poop because they heard this is so effective. And listen, I understand because I deal with a very desperate patient population and they've tried everything and the doctors call them crazy and all the stuff that you hear of people like late stage chronic disease not getting the answers. So for the folks that are listening, and Shannon, we'll pass back over to you, who is doing the best on this? Where's the promise? Where's the like the best signal strength on results with FMT?
Yeah, I think we're growing and understanding what kind of protocols can be done. I think one of the contexts to understand in terms of our understanding of treating disease is that oral capsules only came around in 2019, 2020. And that allowed for people to start extending how long we're treating. And that's been the biggest shift in our understanding of using FMT, that a chronic disease requires longer treatment. And part of this is because the way that FMT is broken down is you do this bolus amount. That's the starting ground. That's laying down the seeds to start the garden. The idea here is you extend the maintenance phase. That's a daily dose, like a capsule, because it allows for extended period to allow for better engraftment. But as well, part of doing FMT is making lifestyle changes. If you have been chronically ill for years, you've changed your diet, you've changed how much you exercise, you don't sleep the same. Everything about your life revolves around that illness. So part of getting better is changing the lifestyle so that you're eating to feed the new microbes. You're exercising, you're sleeping better so that you're allowing them to survive. So maintenance happens over that period because if you still eat poorly or you're not eating to a full diverse diet, you're not going to feed all the new microbes, they will die.
Mhm.
That's part of this process. You have to continue to feed them and continue to care for them. With that in mind, we see these early 2013, 2015 studies with miraculous outcomes with really short treatment protocols, but they were done looking at specific symptom changes. As we move into the later 2020s to 2025, what we're seeing is years later, seeing changes that are still happening or maintained because that initial treatment was longer. So in things like IBS, people 52 weeks later looking better and still not having reoccurrences. In things like multiple sclerosis, which has very small amount of studies has been done, but the people are looking a year more later, not going back into for remittent MS, not showing going back into a remittent phase. ASD is a huge area where we're seeing even people comparing short protocols to long protocols and how much better those longer treatment phases are in terms of that early GI changes and after those GI changes, seeing behavioral changes. We see it with anxiety and depression. People are asking questions now about bipolar disorder and trying to understand that because we know how many neurotransmitters are made in the gut. And if restabilizing the gut allows that process to become more stable. One area that I think the research has been the least consistent is with IBD or inflammatory bowel disease. And that's because with ulcerative colitis, the treatment is longer and you have to keep ensuring that no one's slipping back into a remission phase, but the outcomes are outstanding. Over 50% of people showing going to full remission. Crohn's seems to be less consistent. In some cases, you get beautiful outcomes. In some places, you get very little. So the range I put for Crohn's, I think, is somewhere between 15 and 80%, depending on the study. So the problem is, I think it's a mixture of how the study and the prep that's being done beforehand, as well as I think we have the problem where we lump a lot of people into a condition they may not have. So does everyone that's been given Crohn's have Crohn's, or is that no one knew what else to call it, so they told them they have Crohn's? I think we're taking a step back and trying to understand that, like, maybe some of the umbrella terms people have been diagnosed with when they just don't respond to a treatment that a large population do. Well, what's different there? But the GI conditions, ulcerative colitis, amazing. The outcomes are really beautiful there. I think the same thing with IBS. And then SIBO would be another area where the outcomes are really great. And then when we get into the neurological space, like autism spectrum disorder, the early research in Parkinson's is amazing, multiple sclerosis as well, anxiety, depression has been really positive outcomes. And now we're getting into the space of like longevity in Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And we're starting to understand that from an animal model, looks amazing, crazy. The ability to shift and see lifespan and memory changes and cognition and frailty improvements. And in the early stuff, we're seeing very similar profiles in humans, but it's early days, unfortunately.
Jason, you on the clinical side, it's kind of like a new president, prime minister, administration change. Usually they land in the Oval Office and they fire everyone in the last administration and they start over. So how are we prepping in the early days? And I'm sure it's similar now, but I'd love to see if there's any nuance here. Is your microbiome, if you were on the long list of stuff that Shaina just talked about, probably isn't the healthiest. And so when I first heard about this, you come in, you nuke it so that your graft sticks with the new species. Is that still standard of care?
Yeah, that is broadly what, and this has been compared head to head as well in studies. I frankly was skeptical of that when I started in 2018. I was like, I don't know. Of course, that's the conventional approach, but I tried to turn it on its head and took a more natural approach to this using herbal antimicrobials and doing other things like that. Now, some of those patients who didn't do the antibiotics and just chose to do the herbal antimicrobials and other things like that still had a great response. But when comparing the groups, we noticed that overall, there was a more positive enduring response when we had done that cleanup work. Now, this is the common concern from a patient who's gotten here broadly because they have these issues as a result of antibiotics and the nuking, right? Like most of the people that really do FMT and that benefit from FMT have had a history of multiple uses of antibiotics. And so they're very concerned, understandably. The distinction here, though, is that you're going to be following this immediately with FMT. So with that not in place, absolutely, I'd encourage people as much as possible, unless in a life-saving measure, to avoid antibiotics and even long-term use of antimicrobial herbs and everything else. But I do think that still doing antibiotics is a good idea. The caveat here that we're not seeing broadly in conventional medicine or the studies that are being done is actually focusing on the antifungals as well. And so there is some research around this. For example, in C. diff, they treated them and they found that the patients that have like a fungal bloom or a fungal overgrowth didn't see as much engraftment as the patients who didn't have that. And so in my experience, we've always combined it. Not always. I started to do this as we experimented with things, but we always now, when we're suggesting protocols to clinics or doctors or whatnot, we always encourage, if you're going to do an antibiotic, which we encourage, you should combine it with an antifungal like a nystatin, a diflucan, etc. And then the other layer to this, which makes it a little more complex, is mold fits as well in the category of a fungal issue. And so, especially when patients know there's a mold issue, we might encourage to do something like an itraconazole or something as well as a part of the prep stage, just to clean everything up as well. And there's testing and other things that can be brought into this. But yeah, ultimately, that's ultimately how we think about this, the cleanup part with the antibiotics, antifungals, potentially an anti-mold protocol. But then there's a pause. You do a clean out with like a bowel prep could be like a conventional colonoscopy prep, although we found most success with just using magnesium citrate and ultimately getting to loose bowels. And that all combined helped set up this sort of environment, this garden, so to speak, for ultimate best uptake of the new microbes that we're transplanting.
Curious, do you use binders, charcoal, anything in some of the, especially if they have mold or some of the other kind of die-off species to help with that with the magnesium?
Definitely in the pre-treatment part of it. It could be done in that like bowel when you're doing the bowel cleanse and clean out. You could do that. However, during the treatment, we're encouraging people to avoid those because they do bind somewhat indiscriminately. And so we're generally suggesting to avoid that during the actual FMT protocol. But pre to that, absolutely, especially if there's mold.
Yeah, I've gotten pushback on this where I've a few cases here and there where I've been referring this out, obviously. And you're a natural medicine guy. Why would you recommend antibiotics? And I'm like, look, there's a time and a place for everything. You got a raging infection. That's what it's for. And in this case, stuff ain't cheap. And my argument is it's a hell of a lot cheaper than the next 20 years of biologics and all the bullshit you're going through because it gets the job done more often than not. But if you're doing it, you set yourself up for success and you do it according to the protocols that we know work best. Yeah, I'm not a fan of antibiotics, but I'm not a fan of guns. There are use cases for all things. And so let's not be too polarized and hippy dippy about it. At the end of the day, I want to see this IBD go away. At the end of the day, I want to see you get your life back. And that's really where I've seen a lot of promise. So we're doing a clinical trial. We're starting one up with these guys. If you think you're a candidate for this in the podcast, or just go to the show notes of the podcast, we'll put a little button to book a call. We have a PA that's been trained in this that will help identify. We'll have a quick questionnaire and screening to see if you're a candidate. And then we're trying to make this more available to not just our client patient population, but the world at large. Just some of the studies I've seen that you guys keep floating over to my desk have been just jaw dropping. And your conventional doctor is not going to be talking about this for 20 more years. And if big pharma keeps browbeating them into playing golf instead of looking up, they're never going to talk about it. And so you need something that is effective and rapidly effective because you lose 5, 6, 10 more years of your life. What's that worth to you? I'll put a button there. There'll be a questionnaire. I just want to make sure that this is for you. And then we'll have one of our kind of clinical staff run through that and just see. And if it is, then we'll see if there's a program for you. Any parting words? I'll go back to Shaina. Any parting words on this? What did we miss? What was really important that might have skipped over in this story?
Yeah, I think the key is that it's good to ask questions when we talk about the environment having impacts, we talk about the food having impacts. All of this comes back to the gut. And I think don't underestimate its importance and understanding that just because you get a new gut microbiome, that includes having to care for it afterwards because it has the beauty of changing with you, and being aware of what gut health actually means is really key. If this is something that you think is a fit, ensure that you look into how do you keep a healthy gut after so that you can maintain it long term.
Thank you. I really appreciate that because people think I'm just going to go bang away and get a facelift and I'll be beautiful for the rest of my life. That's just not how it works. Gravity keeps falling. And the microbiome is only as good as the food you feed it.
Yeah.
And that has never changed. There's no miracle cure for that. Jason, any parting words?
Yeah, I've just sat across the desk from so many people that have felt hopeless. And as we started the story, like that's how I got here. And my parting advice would be that it doesn't need to stay that way. This may not be the magic bullet for everybody, but there is 100% a way to get out of this hell. And a lot of it just, you've got to take the initiative and own this. You got to own this. Don't give up, keep fighting. And this is for a lot of people an amazing solution. But this is not the only thing, as Shaina just pointed out as well. This is where your journey starts. You got to get the foundation right. But from there, you got to sleep. You got to avoid all of the crap that's in our environment. No boozing, no smoking. You can get and stay well. And when I've sat in those conversations and someone has felt better for an hour, I said, look, if you could feel better for an hour, you can feel better for a day. And if you can feel better for a day, you can feel better for a year. And it can just go on from there. But I think this can be a real seed of hope for people in a world where a lot of people do feel hopeless, do feel left out, do feel there's really no light or path for them. And if you're that person, I sympathize with you and hope you build up the courage and energy and motivation to just make a small step today. And if you're not far gone and you're still like overall, well, something's off. I mean, frankly, I wish more people would have come to this earlier. Don't wait. As Shaina said with the Parkinson's, like the early signs are there. Your body is telling you a story. Pick up the phone, man. Listen, because a small decision today, even with your microbiome, like you change your diet today in 24 hours, it starts to look different. And so you can make an impact today by all of the small little decisions that you make that cumulatively over time create lasting, meaningful, positive, enduring change.
I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate the work that you're both doing. This is the beginning of this story. I think the story will blow up 5, 6 years from now because it's just more and more patient outcomes and turnaround stories that we keep hearing about. Again, if you're listening to this, go to the page of my podcast and click on, we'll put a button down there and just see if you're a candidate. If you know someone in your life that is suffering from all the myriad things that we talked about, share this episode with them. It's an episode of hope. This may not be the solution for you or them, but it's just another drop in the bucket of further awareness that opens you up to other avenues other than a hopeless future. Thank you for doing the work that you all are doing. And I'm looking forward to collaborating. And we're going to track data. We're doing cardiometabolic panels. We're doing GI maps, oral microbiome. We're testing everything on our clients anyways. So the ones that go through FMT, I'm going to have long-term 6-month, 12-month outcomes and just measuring all the stuff that matters, including HRB and just some of the biometric stuff. I'm actually very curious to see what numbers move because from what I'm hearing, there's going to be a lot of surprises in what changes with a new graft.
Amazing.
Thank you both.
That's the good work.
Yeah.
We're here to cheer you on and help you out.
Thank you. Thank you both. All right, that's a wrap. These folks are doing really good work. I've been following their work for a long time. They're into helping people. And this is, again, this is not for everyone, but if this is for you, this could be a game changer. So wherever you're listening to this, just go to theurbanmonk.com/podcast. In the podcast area under this show, I'll have a link to a questionnaire that we got from them that will help determine whether or not this is for you or your loved one. And then if it is for you, then I have a PA who's been trained in this to really help triage and see if this is indeed the care that you can be receiving, and then we'll connect you with the right people. Again, this is not for the lighthearted. This is something that is very serious for people who have serious conditions. I know there's biohackers doing this. I know there's people kind of messing around with this, but looking at the data, looking at the literature and the research that's come out, I'm just seeing really compelling evidence that this is working for sick people who have had gut dysbiosis for too long. Again, if that's you, fill out the questionnaire and let's see if these folks can help you. I'll see you in the next show.